The wind on the open prairie has a memory. It carries the smell of dry earth, distant sagebrush, and sometimes the metallic scent of old fear and recent rain. But on that one blistering Tuesday in the small dusty town of Redemption, Nevada, the wind carried something else. The raw, choked sound of a woman's despair. Her name was May, though most folks just called her the laundress, or worse, the foreign woman. Her 3 children, no older than a handful of years each, with eyes like startled deer, clung to her faded, blood-splattered skirt, tiny anchors in a world that had suddenly tilted and spun them onto hard ground. May was hunched over the splintered wheel of her tiny, rickety wagon. She wasn't crying. The well of tears had dried up days ago, replaced by a fierce, silent resolve that felt more like a physical burn behind her ribs. Her arm, wrapped clumsily in a piece of torn muslin, throbbed with a pain that was more than just the deep bruise. It was the sting of betrayal, of being judged and struck down by the very men whose soiled, whiskey-stained shirts she had faithfully cleaned for pennies. They demanded more than money. They demanded that which she would not give, and when she refused, they took their pay in wreckage, smashing her meager living and leaving her with a wound that went deeper than the skin. The small crowd around her wasn't offering help. They were offering silence, that cold, heavy silence that is the true sound of a community turning its back. Some looked away, uncomfortable witnesses to injustice. Others, the usual gang of saloon-hardened men, were sneering, their faces an ugly mash of contempt and crude satisfaction. "Go back where you belong, heathen," one slurred, tossing a half-eaten apple peel near her children's feet. May pulled her children closer, a low, guttural sound escaping her throat, the sound of a mother who had just run out of road, run out of strength, and run out of hope. This was the raw, brutal truth of the American West that history books often leave out, the sheer, unvarnished loneliness of the outsider. And then the light changed. Not the sun, which was already merciless, but the air itself seemed to crackle and shift, signaling the arrival of a force of nature. Big John Kincaid didn't just walk into a room or a street, he arrived. He was less a man and more a mountain carved from sun-baked leather and muscle, a giant of a rancher whose hands could mend a fence post or snap a steer's neck with equal ease. His presence was a gravity well. He wore the dust of his 1,000-acre ranch, the barquet, like a badge of office. The brim of his worn hat cast a permanent shadow over eyes that were the color of glacial ice, sharp and unervingly clear. John had been in the assay office, settling a complicated deal for a fresh silver strike on his land, his mind already miles away back on the ranch, when the murmurs of the street reached him. A woman. Trouble. Foreign. He walked slowly, deliberately, the rhythmic clack-thud of his heavy, spurred boots against the wooden boardwalk a terrifying countdown. When he saw May, the tiny, brave, wounded woman, and her frightened, silent children huddled over the wreckage, and the smug, cruel faces of the men who had done this, something snapped inside the big man. Not a violent snap, but a cold, hard decision like the setting of a trap. He stopped directly in front of the group of tormentors, blocking the sun. His shadow was vast, encompassing May and her children in a sudden, protective eclipse. He didn't raise his voice. In fact, he spoke so softly that the men had to lean in to hear him, which only added to the terrifying intimacy of the moment. "Which one of you boys decided to settle a debt with a broken wheel and a bleeding woman?" he asked. The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. The ringleader, a mean-spirited foreman named Silas who worked for a rival cattle baron, tried to puff himself up. "Now, John, this ain't none of your affair. That woman had it comin'. She got uppity. It's a matter of—" Silas stopped, his words dissolving on his tongue as John Kincaid took a single, slow step closer. John didn't draw a gun. He didn't even flex his immense hands. He just looked at Silas, a look of utter, unblinking contempt, the kind a man reserves for a particularly vile insect. "Justice," John cut in, his voice a low, rumbling earthquake. "You were going to say justice, Silas? Because all I see is a coward who used his size and his friends against a woman who was just trying to feed her babies." The sheer weight of John's disapproval was enough to make Silas visibly shrink. The other men started shuffling their feet, looking anywhere but at John. They knew better than to cross Big John Kincaid. His word was law on the barquet and carried a heavy threat of consequences even in town. He was a man who stood for fairness, a stark, unshakable pillar of honor in a world often ruled by greed and brute force. John turned his broad back on the cowards, dismissing them entirely, and knelt in the dirt before May. Kneeling was an effort for the giant, and the action alone conveyed a respect that stunned the onlookers into absolute silence. His iced-tea eyes, now softened with an unexpected compassion, met May's guarded, fierce ones. He didn't offer empty platitudes or pity. He offered a simple, brutal assessment of the facts. "Your wagon is done for," he stated, his voice now gentle but undeniably firm. "Your arm needs proper tending, not just a rag. And those babies need to be out of this dust and away from this kind of ugliness." May just stared up at him, her lips trembling slightly. She had learned the hard way that a kind face often hid the sharpest knife. She spoke then, her English heavily accented but clear, the words fueled by desperation and pride. "I do not need charity, sir. I have my work. I just need for these men to leave us be." The dignity in her voice, even in her wounded, low moment, struck John with unexpected force. This wasn't a victim. This was a warrior whose armor had simply cracked. He stood up, towering over her, and his gaze swept over the town square one last time, a final, clear warning to all within earshot. He extended a massive, calloused hand toward her. "You misunderstand, May," he said, his voice echoing with finality, the words meant for the whole of Redemption to hear. "This isn't charity. This is an offer of employment. And protection." He looked her directly in the eye, and the power of his resolve was absolute. "You're going with me," the giant rancher said. "The Barquet needs a laundress. And my ranch hands need to learn a thing or two about respect. You and your children are coming with me, and anyone who lays a hand on you there will answer to me." His statement was less an invitation and more a declaration of war against injustice. He didn't wait for her answer. He simply scooped up the smallest child with his free arm, his strength making the little boy look weightless, and then without another word, he turned and began walking toward his own massive, pristine ranch wagon waiting down the street. It was a silent, unarguable order. May, with no other choice and a sudden, terrifying flicker of hope reigniting the fire in her soul, instinctively gathered her remaining two children and followed the great long shadow of the man who had just claimed her future. The town watched them go, stunned. A massive, irreversible line had been drawn in the dirt of Redemption. The journey to the Barquet Ranch was silent, the kind of silence that is heavy with unspoken questions and the possibility of a new life. May sat in the wide, comfortable seat of John Kincaid's wagon, her three children nestled against her, their fears slowly giving way to awe as the vast, breathtaking landscape of the open range unfolded around them. This wasn't the cramped, filthy alleyway of Redemption. This was a world of endless blue sky and golden brown hills that seemed to roll right up to the feet of the distant, snow-capped mountains. John Kincaid drove with a quiet authority, his hands resting easily on the reins, his presence a strange blend of intimidating power and unexpected serenity. May risked a glance at him. He was not a conventionally handsome man. His face was a roadmap of hard work and sun exposure, but there was an honesty in the set of his jaw and a deep-seated intelligence in his eyes that she hadn't seen in a man for a very long time. She had spent her life on the fringes, always having to fight for every inch of dignity, and she knew the true weight of a man's word. John's word, she sensed, was iron. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice soft, barely audible over the clop of the horse's hooves. It was the only question that truly mattered. John took a moment, letting the silence stretch again before he answered. "My father built this ranch on two things," he said, his voice a low, thoughtful baritone. "Hard work and a square deal for every soul under its roof. It's not just about cattle and profit, May. It's about standing for something. That kind of meanness back there, that's a disease. And a good man, a good ranch, can't afford to be infected by it. You were wronged. Plain and simple. I have the means to make it right. That's my why." He paused, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "And honestly, I need a good laundress. My boys have been wearing shirts so stiff with dust and sin they can almost stand up on their own." A faint, unexpected smile touched the corner of his mouth, a flash of warmth that melted some of the ice in his eyes and made him look, suddenly, less like a giant and more like a weary, decent man. The simple, non-heroic humanity of his explanation was more comforting to May than any grand, sweeping declaration. The Barquet was an empire. The main house, built of heavy, rough-hewn timber, sat like a king on a slight rise, surrounded by a complex of barns, corrals, and bunkhouses that spoke of serious, long-term industry. The moment they arrived, John's first action wasn't to delegate, it was to care. He gently handed the children to his longtime formidable housekeeper, Mrs. Delgado, a woman whose stern exterior hid a heart of Spanish gold. Then he personally disinfected and neatly bandaged May's arm, his large hands moving with surprising tenderness and precision, a man used to tending to the wounds of livestock and occasionally, his own men. His respect was immediate and tangible. The next day was the true test. John gathered his rough-and-tumble crew of cowboys, a mix of young, eager hands, grizzled veterans, and one or two whose pasts were best left unexamined. They were all men who respected John Kincaid, not just for his wealth, but for his unbending fairness. Standing before them, his presence filling the corral, John didn't preach. He laid down the new law, stark and unblinking. May and her children are now part of the Barquet, he announced, his voice carrying clearly over the morning sounds of the ranch. She is employed here as laundress and kitchen help, earning a fair wage. She and her children are to be treated with absolute respect. No slurs, no sneers, no unkindness, no matter how small you think it is. They are to be shown the same courtesy you would show my sister were she here. Is that understood? He let his gaze fall on each man one by one. I will not tolerate the kind of cowardly cruelty that goes on in town. This ranch is clean. My home is clean. And by God, my conduct and yours will be clean. If you have a problem with it, he finished, his tone dropping to a deadly serious whisper, you can pack your bags and be gone before sundown without your last week's pay. You want to stay, you live by the Barquet's rules. No exceptions. Now get to work. It was a powerful, uncompromising statement of justice and inclusion, a testament to the belief that courage wasn't just about facing down a gunman, but about standing up for the defenseless. The ranch hands, being men of the West who understood a clear line drawn in the sand, absorbed the order. They saw the sincerity in their boss's eyes and knew he meant every word. Slowly, grudgingly at first, then naturally the atmosphere around May changed. The children were given small tasks, helping to collect eggs or feed the chickens, their initial shyness melting under the kind, if sometimes awkward, attention of the cowboys. May, for her part, worked tirelessly. Her laundry was impeccable, her food flavorful and unique, a welcome change from the bland ranch fare. Her pride was a beautiful thing to witness. She took no handout, only earned wages, and her work was a quiet, powerful expression of her gratitude and her fierce self-respect. The months that followed were a gradual weaving together of two vastly different worlds. John Kincaid and May often found themselves together in the quiet hours after sundown, discussing not just ranch business but life. He taught her the workings of the ranch, the rhythm of the seasons. She, in turn, shared stories of her homeland, stories steeped in a wisdom and patience that deeply affected the lonely, self-contained rancher. The initial relationship of protector and protected slowly, almost imperceptibly, matured into one of mutual respect, then shared understanding, and finally, a gentle, profound admiration. The true Wild West love story wasn't the sudden, dramatic sweep of a hero off a saloon floor, but the slow, deliberate realization that they were two people from two opposite ends of the world, fighting the same battle for dignity, justice, and a place to truly belong. They were each, in their own powerful way, giants in a world that sought to make them small. The Barquet, under Big John's uncompromising rule, had not just given May shelter. It had taught a community a powerful, enduring lesson. That courage is measured not by the size of your hand, but by the size of your heart, and that true pride is only found when you stand up for what is right, no matter the cost. The wind still blew across the prairie, but now, it carried the gentle sound of children's laughter mixed with the low, hopeful rumble of a man's quiet resolve. The shadow of Big John Kincaid was no longer just a shadow of protection, but a light of a new, inclusive American life. This is the continuation you requested, part 3 of the story, written in the same emotionally engaging, humanized style. The winter descended upon the Barquet with a quiet, biting ferocity, but inside the main house, a warmth had taken root that no blizzard could extinguish. It was the warmth of purpose, of earned place, and of a strange, unforeseen kinship. May had blossomed. She was no longer just a laundress, she was the indispensable heart of the household. Her organization brought an efficiency the ranch had never known. The children, too, thrived in the wide open space. They were no longer the silent, fearful shadows of the town, but loud, laughing sparks of energy, their small, confident figures weaving through the barnyards, under the watchful, surprisingly patient eyes of the cowboys. Little Way, the middle child, had become the shadow of Big John, following him everywhere, learning to mimic the rancher's slow, deliberate stride. This sight, the giant, rugged man and the small Chinese boy, was a constant, powerful and wordless sermon to every man on the ranch about the true meaning of family, which was not always born of blood. The unspoken bond between John and May had deepened past mere employment and protection. In the long, flickering lamplight after the children were asleep, they would share the simple, profound rituals of two people who had found solace in each other's company. They didn't speak of love, not in the sweeping, dramatic way of dime novels. Their connection was built on quieter, stronger things, The shared sigh over a perfectly mended piece of clothing, the subtle pride in a successful cattle drive, and the mutual respect for the scars they both carried. May found herself looking past the intimidating bulk of John Kincaid to the deep kindness and quiet, self-sacrificing core of the man. She saw the heavy burden he carried as the pillar of the ranch, and she began in small, careful ways to lighten it. She was the only person who dared to tell him to rest, or who would quietly leave a bowl of her special healing tea by his chair when he worked late into the night. But happiness in the wild, unpredictable West often comes with a looming shadow. News as persistent as the dust eventually traveled. The men who had attacked May, Silas and his cronies, had been smarting for months over the public humiliation delivered by John Kincaid. John's refusal to apologize, his clear, unwavering moral stance, was seen by their boss, the rival rancher Cyrus Vance, as a direct challenge to his authority and to the established rough order of the region. Vance was a man of old resentments and new money, who believed that might, not justice, made right. He saw John's protection of May not as a moral act, but as a political weakness, a soft spot to be exploited. One blustery afternoon, when John was miles away inspecting a far-flung fence line, a rider appeared on the horizon, kicking up a rooster tail of dry snow. It was a young hand from town, his face pale and tight with fear. He came bearing a message that sent a chill through the warm heart of the barquet. "Mr. Vance," he sent a message, "ma'am," the boy stammered, addressing May directly, a new, respectful formality in his tone that had replaced the scorn of months ago. He said that if John Kincaid keeps a foreign woman and her children on the barquet, then he is harboring undesirables. He's gone to the authorities and claimed that May's children were illegally brought across the border, and that they must be taken and returned to the proper channels. The air in the kitchen went instantly cold. Mrs. Delgado gasped, crossing herself quickly. May froze, the soup ladle dropping with a dull, sickening clang against the wooden floor. The threat was vile, cruel, and terrifyingly legal. In that era, the law was often a blunt instrument wielded by the powerful against the vulnerable, and the concept of justice was often reserved for those who could afford it. The ranch hands who heard the news immediately rallied, their faces a thundercloud of indignation. "We'll ride out and teach Vance a lesson," one young cowboy yelled, his hand automatically reaching for his rifle. "We can't let him do this to the boss." But May, recovering from the initial shock with the same fierce resolve she had shown in the town square, held up a steady hand. "No," she commanded, her voice surprisingly firm, cutting through the sudden chaos. "We will not bring violence to the barquet. Mr. Kincaid stood for justice, not for a brawl." She looked at the worried faces around her, her own face set in a mask of determined courage. "This is my fight. My children are not a weapon for Mr. Vance to use against John." Yet, beneath her brave exterior, the fear was a cold knot. The children were her world, and the thought of them being dragged back into the cold, uncaring machinery of a world that didn't want them ignited a desperate, burning need to act. When John finally returned, exhausted and caked in ice and mud, the first thing he saw was the quiet tension in the faces of his men, and the way May was holding her children with an unnaturally tight grip. As he listened to the grim news, his initial rage, a powerful earth-shaking thing, slowly gave way to a cold, strategic fury. He knew that Vance wasn't after the children. He was after John's honor, his reputation, and his land. He was using the weakest link to break the chain. But John had learned one thing about May: she was no one's weak link. "He wants a fight, May?" "He'll get a fight," John said, pulling her gently toward him, his huge hands resting on her shoulders, offering a non-romantic but profoundly protective shield. "But not with fists. With the law. And with the truth. We will bring the barquet's justice right to his doorstep." John realized that he had to do more than simply employ her. He had to build an unassailable wall around her and her children. His protection had to be formalized, made permanent, recognized by the very system Vance was trying to exploit. That night, John sat at his desk, the lamp casting his giant silhouette against the wall. He wrote a flurry of telegrams to the best lawyers he knew in the territory, not to defend himself, but to petition for an official standing. He was going to stand up in a courtroom in front of the judge and the whole town of Redemption, and declare his full legal commitment. May watched him from the doorway, her heart a tangled mess of terror, gratitude, and a soaring, unfamiliar pride. She knew then that the greatest act of courage was not the one performed in the heat of a moment, but the quiet, deliberate decision to stake one's entire life and reputation on the dignity of another human being. The next morning, John looked at May, his glacier eyes filled with an iron resolve. "We're going to town, May," he said. And this time we aren't just leaving a shadow. We're laying down roots. Together. The journey back to redemption would not be a retreat, but a powerful, courageous march toward a final reckoning, where the meaning of justice and the true heart of the Barquet would be put on display for all to see. The wind that day carried no fear. It carried the promise of a showdown based on dignity. This is the final continuation you requested, part 4 of the story, written in the same emotionally engaging, humanized style, concluding the narrative with a powerful focus on justice and dignity. The journey back to redemption was fundamentally different from the terrified flight months before. This time, May and her children rode not as refugees, but as a family unit under the unmistakable protection of Big John Kincaid. The children, now less fearful of the world, waved at the occasional passerby. May held her head high, the pride earned through honest work and fierce courage serving as an invisible armor. John, riding beside the wagon on his massive sorrel stallion, was silent, his focus absolute. He wasn't just bringing his family to town. He was bringing the Barquet's moral code to a courthouse where justice often bent to power. The courtroom in Redemption was a small, stifling place, packed solid with curious and often hostile onlookers. Cyrus Vance, the rival rancher, sat at a table with his smug-faced foreman, Silas, clearly savoring what he believed would be John's public defeat. Vance's lawyer was a sharp, slick man who spoke in confusing legal jargon, painting May as a burden and her children as a drain on the community, a legal argument designed to exploit the prejudices of the time. The air crackled with tension, fear, and the ugly undertones of discrimination. John's lawyer, a respected and stern jurist John had brought from the state capitol, methodically dismantled the legal claims. But the turning point came when John Kincaid rose to speak, not just as a wealthy man, but as a witness to character and a pillar of the community. He ignored his lawyer's formal prompting and spoke directly to the judge and the assembled crowd, his voice deep, slow, and radiating the unshakable truth. "Your Honor," John began, his gaze sweeping over the room until it locked briefly onto Vance. "Mr. Vance claims that May and her children are undesirables. He claims they have no place here. He uses the law to try and rip a family apart just to settle a petty feud with me." He paused, his presence commanding absolute silence. "But let me tell you what I know. I know that May works harder than any man I've hired in 10 years. I know that her presence has brought dignity and honesty back to my ranch. I know that my men, rough, hard men, have learned what it means to be courteous and honorable because they see the courage of that small woman and her small children every day." He then walked toward May, who sat perfectly still, holding her youngest child. He didn't touch her. He simply stood beside her, a magnificent, towering sentinel. "The true measure of a community, Your Honor, isn't who we keep out. It's who we bring in and how we treat them when they're here. These children," he said, his voice softening, "are as American as the dust on my boots and the sky over my land. They belong here because they were earned here, through honesty and hardship. And I will not allow them to be sent away." Then came the profound, powerful resolution. John didn't just ask the judge to dismiss the case. He took one last, crucial step. "4 months now I have stood as their protector. But now I want to stand as their family. I am formally petitioning this court today, to declare my intention to legally adopt these 3 children, and if she will have me." He looked down at May, a question in his eyes that was a world away from the one he had asked that day in the wagon, "to ask May to become my wife. We are already a family at the Barquet. I ask the law to simply recognize the truth." The courtroom erupted in a stunned murmur. This wasn't just legal maneuvering. It was a profound, public declaration of love and commitment that transcended race, custom, and prejudice. It was a clear, unambiguous statement that John Kincaid was putting his immense wealth, his towering reputation, and his very name on the line for the dignity and security of a wounded immigrant family. The judge, a weathered old man who had seen too much injustice in the West, rapped his gavel for silence, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He looked at May, whose own eyes were now streaming, but not from fear, from the overwhelming, sudden force of hope. She nodded once, a clear, unmistakable yes, that required no translation. In the end, the judge's verdict was swift and unequivocal. He dismissed Vance's malicious claims and, with a powerful, echoing finality, granted John Kincaid the initial petition for marriage and adoption. "The law is meant to protect the defenseless, not serve the spiteful," the judge declared, looking pointedly at Vance. "Case dismissed. And Mr. Kincaid, the court commends your courage and your adherence to true justice." Vance and Silas slunk out of the courtroom, defeated not by force, but by a moral strength they could not comprehend. John Kincaid had not only won the day, he had redefined the very meaning of community storytelling and redemption. Outside the courthouse, John turned to May, his face no longer set in a hard mask of defense, but softened by an emotion too deep for words. He didn't need to ask again. The people of redemption watched as the giant rancher gently took the hand of the brave, dignified Chinese mother. The Wild West Western love story was not one of melodrama, but of two courageous souls finding each other across a vast cultural divide, united by a commitment to honor and integrity. They walked out of the dust and into the bright sunlight, a newly declared family, their story a living testament to the powerful truth, that a man's true wealth is the strength of the home he builds, and that the promise of the American West was and always should be, for those who seek dignity and are brave enough to earn it. The Barquet had new roots and they ran deep, wide and across the world. The years that followed the courtroom drama settled over the Barquet ranch with the quiet certainty of a promise kept. The grand declaration of John Kincaid's love and commitment was followed not by high drama, but by the deeper, more profound rhythm of a life truly built together. The wedding was a simple, heartfelt affair held right in the ranch's vast central meadow, beneath the boundless blue sky, a celebration attended by every ranch hand, every neighbor who had the courage to show their support, and most importantly, the three children who now carried the proud new name of Kincaid. May, now Mrs. Kincaid, stood with a serene, unshakable dignity at John's side. She didn't just run the house, she managed the entire domestic side of the Barquet's sprawling operations, her careful planning and sharp, quiet intellect proving indispensable. John often remarked that he had run the Barquet for 20 years, but only now was it truly organized and prosperous. Their relationship was a living example that true partnership transcends background, built on the common ground of mutual respect and shared morality. The children, fully embraced by the colossal love and unyielding protection of their adoptive father, flourished. They grew up sturdy and bright, equally comfortable sorting cattle with the cowboys as they were reading books by the fire. Their heritage was honored, never erased. May taught them the wisdom, the language, and the ancient stories of her homeland, weaving them seamlessly into the fabric of the rugged American West. They were proof that a family isn't a single origin story, but a beautiful, strong rope woven from many different threads. The boys especially took on the quiet, resolute strength of Big John, their eyes reflecting the same clear honesty that had first saved them. The impact of the Kincaid family rippled far beyond the borders of the Barquet redemption. The small town that had once stood by in silence, slowly, painfully began to change. John's powerful stand had been a mirror held up to the community, reflecting its own hidden cruelties. The courage he showed in the courtroom inspired a quiet but irreversible shift in local attitude. When new immigrant families, drawn by the promise of opportunity, began to settle in the valley, they were met with less suspicion and more of the Barquet's brand of rugged, practical assistance. Even Cyrus Vance's malice eventually faded, not because he changed his mind, but because John Kincaid's moral authority was simply too great to challenge. The story of "You're Going With Me" became a local legend, a quiet testament that resonated across the prairies. A story not about a gunfight or gold, but about a giant man choosing to use his strength for the defenseless, creating justice where there was only prejudice. The Kincaid family's story became the very heart of the American West's best tradition. A life earned with hard work, defended with courage and founded on the dignity of all people. Their legacy was not just a successful ranch, but a powerful moral framework for their children and their community. On the Barquet, every sunset was a quiet victory, a beautiful daily reminder that the truest frontier was not the land itself, but the constant, challenging work of building a compassionate and honorable life. The quiet, hopeful laughter of the children, now running free and safe across the plains, was the most beautiful music of all, signifying the resolution and the enduring strength of the human heart. The final, perfect message was that the toughest man in the territory was the one who was brave enough to love. The Barquet Ranch did more than just endure. It became a landmark, a quiet testament to the idea that the true wealth of the West lay not in gold or cattle, but in the moral courage of its people. Decades passed, marked by the changing seasons and the growing height of the three children, who eventually took their places running the vast operation. They were ranch owners with the sharp business acumen inherited from John and the profound, patient wisdom learned from their mother, May. Their success was a powerful, unspoken argument against the prejudice that had once tried to destroy them. The great rancher John Kincaid, the man they still spoke of in the territory as a force of nature, lived a long, fulfilling life, surrounded by the family he had deliberately and bravely chosen. He watched his children grow, marry, and begin families of their own, mixing the strong, silent power of the Kincaid name with the ancient, resilient dignity of their mother's heritage. The ranch house, once a fortress of solitude, was now constantly alive with the joyful noise of multiple generations. A vibrant, multicultural home that stood as a powerful emblem of the American dream's purest promise. May, with the serene strength that was her signature, became the beloved matriarch of the valley, her kitchen a gathering point where neighbors learned that different traditions could blend into a richer, more flavorful life. She never forgot the taste of the dust and the shadow of fear from that day in Redemption, but she taught her grandchildren that fear was only a feeling, while courage was an action. She taught them that the most important thing a person could own was their dignity, and that it was their duty to protect the dignity of others, just as their father had protected theirs. The story of the Kincaids became an essential part of the community storytelling in the region. It wasn't told in history books but around campfires and dinner tables. It was the legend of the giant man who, when faced with an easy choice, to ignore the wounded, and a hard choice, to risk everything for justice, chose the hard road. It was a story that defined the best of the USA life stories. The narrative of the outsider finding a home, and the established figure using his power to tear down walls instead of building them.